Okay, it's Mr. Collins and ready to start our first online lecture, and appreciate your patience and we'll see how this goes. I want to start off talking about timelines in general. This isn't something you need to write down, but I did this in class once about a week and a half ago before the big snowstorm, and when we talk about history we can place it on a timeline, and if we take key dates in American history and lay them out on a timeline, we end up with something that looks like this. And I don't know if it'll show up okay, but the colors of this screen are actually different. They change right in 1776. That before 1776 is before we were a nation, and then we became a nation in 1776. Again, this is a very European history, assuming that, of course, Columbus and Leif Erikson discovered the New World and that all the Native Americans there suddenly apparently didn't know it existed. I want to point out a feature I put on this timeline. I have what looks like a box that we were actually two separate nations for a period of about 4 years during the Civil War. The North, the Union, and the South, the Confederacy. And this is not very well to scale, since 1861 to 1865 looks as big as the period from 1941 to 2001, but you can get a sense of how a timeline is laid out. Please notice that going from left to right, the numbers increase because, like in a normal number line, we are in the positive end. We are AD or CE. We're going to do the same thing with Israel's history, and you do not need to write this down right now, but I want you to notice that the dates on this timeline begin on the far left with the highest number, 968, and then 931, 721, 621, 587, 538, etc. They get progressively smaller, and that's because we're working before Christ, or before the Common Era. And then the year 0, which there actually isn't a year 0, would be right about here, the year that Jesus is born, even though he was probably born about 3 years before Christ. Again, don't write this down. You do not need to know all this. I am not going to test you on dates, but I will probably give you a timeline as a reference on the next test to help you identify the major events and empires that influenced ancient Israel's history. So at this point, I would like you to open your notebook to one of the pages that you drew, the page that looks kind of like a Y. You can pause the video right now while you get your page open to that, and you want the open end of the Y to be to your right. There's another timeline you have that looks more like a J, but I want the one that has the very long, straight, continuous line. Okay, we start with the Exodus. We start with the Exodus, and we don't really have a date for the Exodus. There's no references in the story of Moses or the Pharaoh that could help us date it with any precision. There's no extra biblical references that could help us date it. And even the events that come after that, what we call the period of the Judges, doesn't have any really firm dates associated with it. We could say it took place sometime between 1400 BCE and 1100 BCE, but really associating particular people or events with real history would be almost impossible to do. On that list, you'll notice I have a few names with stars on them. Those are people you will have to know for the test. Who was Joshua, who was Gideon, who was Deborah. Samson is not somebody that you need to know. Some of you might have read about Samson. You do not need to know Eli. You will need to know Deborah. You will need to know Delilah, and you do not need to know Ehud or Jael or some of the other judges we read about in your homework that you had an extra credit opportunity with. The last of the judges is Samuel. We talked about this in class, and he anoints the first king. The first king of the united monarchy, as opposed to the divided monarchy, is King Saul. He actually gets fired as king by the prophet Samuel. Again, we talked about the theocracy and the relationship between the prophet and the king, that the prophet had the job of keeping the king and the people faithful to the covenant and had the authority to anoint a king or to essentially fire a king. The second king is King David, the famous shepherd boy who killed Goliath and who brought the ark to Jerusalem and wanted to build a temple for it. This past weekend you read the story of David and Nathan's sin and how he responded to Nathan. David's son Solomon will be the last of the United Kings. And again, we talked about the relationship of the prophets and the kings and how David responded positively to the prophets. And in your in your classwork next class, you will actually read a story about Saul and Samuel. You will also read a story about Solomon and another prophet who's often overlooked, the prophet Ahijah, and how their relationship plays out. The first real date that we can put on a timeline is the date 968 BCE. Again, you're not going to need to know this date. I'm not going to test you on it, but you might put it on your timeline as a little reference to help link up this timeline with the other one. Solomon built the temple in 968, so about 1,000 years before Jesus, almost 1,000 years before Jesus. And then after Solomon died, the kingdom split. And we talked briefly in class a couple of weeks ago about the schism that took place. After Solomon dies, the kingdom splits, and a guy named Jeroboam actually becomes the king of a separatist nation in the north. You don't need to know that date. You don't need to know Jeroboam's name, but you will be reading about Jeroboam in class next period. And again, you'll have your Bible with you in class. We'll meet in the cafeteria. You'll read a chapter story, and then you'll take a little quiz on it on the iPad, and then you'll move on. You'll read another chapter. You'll take another quiz on the iPad. So I'm trying to paint a picture of this history for you so that you have good notes, so you can study for the next test, and so that you have the historical framework to understand the stories we'll be covering. When the kingdom splits, the tribes in the north will maintain the name of Israel, and that's going to be 10 of the tribes. The main tribe in the south is Judah. That's one of the largest of the 12 tribes, and the small tribe of Benjamin allies with Judah as well. And so from this point on, we'll talk about the divided monarchy. There's going to be a king in the north up in Israel, and there will be a king down in the south in Judah. And so this will be the period of the divided monarchy. And I think this takes us to a new slide. Oh, it does. I'd like you to turn to a fresh page in your notes and draw a basic map of Palestine, or of the land of Canaan, or the land of Israel and Judah. And I don't want you to draw this map precisely because this would be rather difficult. If you look carefully, you should be able to see that this is water over here, where all the legend is, the Mediterranean Sea. Up here is the Sea of Galilee. Down in the south is the Dead Sea, and connecting them very faintly is the Jordan River, a very windy river. I would like you to draw a much simpler version of this map, and I've done it like this. I put the Sea of Galilee as a little blob at the top. I've made the Jordan River look like a straight line coming straight down, and then at the bottom is the Dead Sea. Not a very beautiful picture, but pretty serviceable. And then the western border of the land of Canaan is the Mediterranean. So you should, after all the maps we did last semester, know this. If you are new to my class, I'm sure that Father Shaw and Mr. Ward talked about this geography. If you are new to my class and you don't understand this map, then I want you to check in with me so I can make sure you know it. The schism essentially divides the two kingdoms in half just north of where the Dead Sea is joined by the Jordan River. This is not a precise map. It is a very, very rough map. But the kingdom in the north is going to be Israel, and the kingdom in the south is Judah. So if you would label your map this way as well. The capital of Judah is the city of David, built on Mount Zion. This is where David established the capital of his kingdom of Judah, or the kingdom of Israel for the 12 tribes. And it's where he brought the Ark of the Covenant, and it's where he wanted to build a house, a cedar building for the Ark of the Covenant, but he was told by the prophet Nathan that that job would be left up to his son Solomon. When the two kingdoms split, and this is going to be part of your in-class reading, so I want you to have a physical idea in your head about this. The king in the north, Jeroboam, is worried that his people in Israel will continue going down to Judah to worship. And so in order to keep his people up in his territory and prevent any possibility of reunification, he builds two alternate temples, one in the north at Dan, one in the south at Bethel, and builds idols with golden calves at these two shrines for his people to worship. And this is regarded by the biblical authors as a horrible thing. Again, you'll read about this in class, and is seen as the downfall of Jeroboam's family. The capital of Israel actually shifts around. It's Shechem at one point. It is Tirzah at another point. For our purposes in my class, I'm going to focus on the capital of Israel being in Samaria. There's a king by the name of Omri. You don't need to know him. He establishes Samaria as the capital. It's up on top of a hill like Jerusalem, and it's a fortress city. And that city of Samaria will become important on our next piece of the timeline. So go ahead and make sure you have this map and you've labeled Jerusalem and Samaria. Put a little note somewhere, a little symbol to designate Dan and Bethel and the alternate sanctuaries, so that when you read the story in class next period, you'll understand what's going on. You can now turn to your second timeline, the one that looks more like a J. Okay. Again, 968 BCE is our starting reference point. That's when the temple is built. We still have 12 tribes united under one king, King Solomon. And again, in 931, the kingdom splits. And there's some political reasons. There's some hints in the Bible that there was tension between the northern and southern tribes. But for the purpose of the biblical author, instead of looking at what political events led up to the split, they're going to look for a theological reason or a religious reason why the split took place. So the kingdom in the north will be called Israel from here on out, and the kingdom in the south will be called Judah. The kingdom of Israel, from the perspective of the people who wrote the Bible, and the people who wrote the Bible are the people of Judah, the Jews. The Israelite tribes split off from the true king, that David was seen as the great king, and that the tribes of Judah in general followed the family of David. And the tribes of Israel did not follow the line of David. There are some small exceptions to that, but we will not have time to get into that, though we used to in past years. So from the perspective of the writers of the Bible, the Jews, Israel is seen as apostates. They've turned away from true worship. They've turned away from the temple in Jerusalem. They've turned away from the kingdom of David and his family, and they are seen as doomed and just sinful, and that they have one bad king after another, with a very, very few small exceptions. So to illustrate this, one of the stories you'll be reading in class next period is the story of Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab's a king, Jezebel's his wife, the queen, and their battles against two of ancient Israel's greatest prophets, the prophet Elijah and the prophet Elisha. I sometimes pronounce that Elisha just to make it distinctive. You will not actually read any of the Elisha narratives. I will probably make some of those stories available for extra credit. You'll read about Elijah's battles with Ahab and Elijah's battles with Jezebel as two of your in-class readings. And again, for the authors of the Bible, the kings in the north are bad. They're just horrible. And Ahab is seen as the worst of the worst. Historically, don't write this down, it's not going to be tested on. Historically, scholars have found that Ahab was probably a pretty powerful and pretty prosperous king, but the Bible doesn't talk about his success as a politician. The Bible is only concerned with what a horrible person he was and how awful his wife was. So, again, as I said already about the split, there are political reasons for why the kingdom is split, but the authors of the Bible are interested in presenting a theological reason, a religious understanding of why it happened. And the evil of Israel is seen as a justification for what happens to them. The Assyrian Empire emerges out of the Fertile Crescent area, and the Assyrian Empire begins to expand its borders and conquer smaller nations. And in 721, the Assyrians come down, they lay siege to the capital city of Samaria and take it. A lot of carnage ensues, and the Assyrians effectively take over the northern tribes of Israel. And at that point, the Assyrians do something interesting. And this is important. I want you to jot some notes about this, because each of the empires we're going to talk about, Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, each of the empires has a specific way of running their country or running their empire to keep control of people. And what the Assyrians do, they conquer Israel, they behead hundreds of the defending troops of Samaria. What they do next then is take most of the population, or a large segment of the population of the north, and they send them away in exile north to Assyria and to different areas that the Assyrians have conquered. And their thinking behind this is you don't want people in the same place with people they know, because that could be a recipe for rebellion. They know where all the hiding places are, they have a common identity, and they might band together and fight against the Assyrians. So you take, let's say somebody conquered the United States, you take some people from Arizona and you put them in Oregon where they're not used to the rain, and you take some of the people in Oregon and you put them in Nebraska where they're not used to tornadoes, and you take some of the people from New York and you put them down in Florida where they're not used to the alligators, and you take the people that you've conquered and deport them to different places. So in 721, what effectively happens from the perspective of the Bible is the northern tribes of Israel, the 10 tribes of Israel, disappear from the face of the earth. They are sent away into exile, and they are settled in different territories of Assyria, and they cease to exist as distinctive Israelites. They probably got absorbed into the cultures where they were deported to. And then what the Assyrians do after they've taken the Israelites into exile is they bring in people from foreign nations to settle in the northern territories. Oops, excuse me, that's the wrong one. They bring people from conquered territories in other areas and settle them in the north. And it so happens that these people intermarry with the few Israelites who are left, and then they adopt the local religion. They begin worshiping this god Yahweh that the people of the north worshipped, and they worship at the golden calf shrines that were made by Jeroboam. And the people in the south, the Jews, do not like these foreigners. They don't like these people from the Assyrian Empire coming in and adopting their religion or thinking that they worship Yahweh too. They see them as fakos or posers or wannabes, however you want to do it. And the Jews in the south hate these newcomers. They resent them. And they don't want to call them Israelites because the Israelites were part of the original 12 tribes. Instead, the people in the south name these people Samaritans. Write that word down, Samaritans. And that word comes from Samaria, the former capital of the north, and it becomes a sort of a put-down word, that the Samaritans think that they're Israelites, they think that they're Jews, but they're not. They're foreigners. They came in here. They didn't come out of the desert with Moses and the Exodus. They didn't fight under Joshua. They're not real Jews. They're not real Israelites. They think they are. And in turn, the Samaritans don't like the Jews. They see themselves as maybe more faithful to the Jewish religion for whatever reason. So a lot of tension exists between Jews and Samaritans, and it only gets worse as the centuries go on. So many of you have probably heard the term Good Samaritan, and this would not have been the kind of association that a Jew would have. The fact that Jesus tells a story where a Samaritan is the hero of the story would have been really disturbing, would have really thrown his listeners for a loop. So again, you should know about Assyria and how they conquered the north, how they sent the people into exile, and then how they brought the people back from other countries, and that those people became the Samaritans. Those are two really important testable events. Meanwhile, in the south, if I can go back to that, in the south, the Assyrian Empire actually came down and attacked Jerusalem some years after they conquered the northern tribes. And there's Assyrian records, and the Bible talks about how the Assyrian emperor came down, conquered several cities, and then laid siege to Jerusalem. And this is another one of your readings for our next class. You're going to read about King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, probably one of the most well-known prophets in the Old Testament. He even has one of the largest prophetic books written after him, the largest prophetic book written by him or attributed to him. And Hezekiah is the king of Judah when the Assyrian Empire attacks and lays siege to Jerusalem. And at the risk of giving you a spoiler alert, Hezekiah survives the Assyrian invasion. And there's a tiny little hint about why in the Bible itself. There's also been some recent archaeological evidence that helps us understand why that happened. But again, the Bible is going to be interested in describing not the political or military reasons why a country fell or why a country survived. It's more interested in a theological or religious interpretation. So the reason for the biblical authors, the reason why the north fell to Assyria is because they had all these horrible kings like Ahab and Jezebel and many others. And the reason why the south survived is because they were faithful to the family of David and because they had good kings like Asa and Hezekiah and Josiah and others. So one of your readings tomorrow is going to be about Hezekiah and Isaiah, and what's taking place at that time is the Assyrian invasion and siege of Jerusalem. I'm going to move rather quickly here. This is not as important. I'm going to pick up on this next class. The next empire, need to make a little note about Egypt. During Israel's history, obviously Egypt is where the Jews were held in slavery and escaped during the Exodus. But during the history of Israel and Judah, Egypt, which was very, very close to Palestine, was always involved in their political and military interactions with Assyria and Babylonia. Don't write this down. The Egyptians were allies to the Assyrians in 721, and Egypt was allies to the northern tribes in 721, and that's one of the reasons why Assyria attacked them. And sometimes the kingdoms of Israel and Judah would fight against Egypt on the side of Assyria and Babylonia. So just to know that Egypt was an empire in the wings that was involved in their history is important, but not the specifics of it. Babylon, or the Babylonian Empire, is going to take over the Assyrian Empire and is going to be the next empire that impacts ancient Israel's history. You will read about, not next class, but next week, about King Josiah of Judah and the prophetess Huldah. And not too long after Josiah's reign, the southern kingdom of Judah is going to fall to the Babylonians, just as the northern tribes fell to the Assyrian Empire. I'm going to go very, very quickly. Do not write this stuff down. I'm going to cover this again in a later lecture. Babylonia, actually, write this down. Babylonia has the same policy. They're going to send the people of Judah into exile in the same way. And here's a vocab word I want you to know. The word is diaspora. The word diaspora has a Greek origin. You don't need to know that. And I like to say dispersion because our English word dispersion is etymologically related to that. The Jewish people and the Israelites begin to move outside of the land of Canaan. That for most of its history, the Israelites lived in Israel, lived in Palestine. But after the Assyrian invasion of 721, after the Babylonian invasion of 587, into the Persian, Greek, Roman period, Jews begin to move into Egypt. They move into Persia. They move into Greece. They move as far as Rome. And this is a new phenomenon in religion where people begin to take their religion with them. And there's theological developments that happen with that I will talk about in a later lecture. Just to leave it on a more positive note, the southern kingdom actually comes back from exile. The Persians take over, and in 538 let the Jews come home and rebuild their temple, rebuild their society. Eventually the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great will take over from Persia. That will lead to the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean rebellion against Greece. There will be a brief period of Jewish independence, and then after some infighting among the ruling families, the Romans will step in about 70 years before Jesus and establish their control of Palestine as well. And again, each of these empires does something different in Jewish history, and each has their own way of running an empire. Okay, so quick little recap. Here's who you are going to read about in class. I don't think you need to write this down, but you can take a screenshot of this or something. Control print screen is at the top of your keyboard, and then you can save it and look at it later. Next class, you'll read about the prophet Samuel and King Saul. You'll read about Solomon and the prophet Ahijah, Jeroboam and a couple of different prophets, a couple of stories about Ahab and Jezebel and the prophet Elijah, and Hezekiah and Isaiah. There's going to be 6 different readings to do, and if all goes according to plans, you will cover that. You should know about, as you come into class, the end of the judges, the start of the monarchy, that transition. We've talked about that in class already. The schism and a little bit about Jerusalem, Samaria, Bethel, and Dan. The Assyrian conquest of Israel and Judah's survival. And then words that you should put into your notebook in the appropriate pages. You already have or should have theocracy, Messiah, and Christos, and you should add the words Samaritans and diaspora to your notes as well. And that's going to end us here, so I will go back to YouTube and stop.